Jackie Judd is in the Capitol Plaza there. Jackie, your impressions?
Well, Peter, it's an impression that there is such a marked contrast of emotions here. What you're seeing on camera there is the former president, no doubt, with something of a pained heart. And then alongside, behind the columns of Republicans who are here to see the president off, are the very, very joyful aides of Bill Clinton, who have toiled in the vineyards for many, many months with him. They went to one city after the other, and today they saw their man ascend to the top. So one of very, very contrasting emotions. Earlier today, Marlon Fitzwater came by and talked to us about Mr. Bush. He said he was walking the White House grounds this morning, and suddenly from about 40 feet away, a booming voice came out. It was a tourist who said, "Thank you, Mr. President. We love you. You did a great job." And Fitzwater said that made the president's day.
There will be very little, almost no ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base. Usually there's a band and a group of troops to be reviewed and all of that. 21-gun salute, so on. George Bush said he didn't want any of it. He wanted this to be Bill Clinton's day in the sun. And so very little will happen out there, except that he'll get out of the helicopter, walk to this big airplane, and fly to Houston.
George Bush, who, like his predecessor Ronald Reagan, has so enjoyed his association with the military, his visible association. I was thinking yesterday, looking at some of the great photographs that are always taken by the Washington Press Corps of him in Saudi Arabia with the troops before Desert Storm. But again, I'll defer to Britt Hume here and then to Sam Donaldson. The sense is, I have Britt and Sam first in these final days, is the heart really went out of it for George Bush, despite all of this public politeness. You agree?
Well, I think so, Peter, to some extent. But remember, in the last days, George Bush did seem to come alive with a flurry of activity. Of course, mainly on the foreign front and mainly in response to confrontations with Saddam Hussein and, of course, the humanitarian effort in Somalia. But in a way, Bush's finest hours of the last 12 months probably were the last 2 months. And in that way, you see his popularity rating has come back up to the 60 percentile range. If he'd only had that 3 months ago, he wouldn't be leaving town today.
Things would be different.
Right.
Timing is everything in politics, it is said so often. George Will, you, not to put too fine a point on it, you and George Bush were never regarded as particularly close. What are your thoughts about him as he leaves?
Well, in a way, he would have been a great 19th century president. That is, a president before we had a presidential nation where people tended to look to and key their emotions off the rhetoric of a president. He's a president who had a hard time connecting with the American people and seemed most comfortable when thinking elsewhere about foreign policy matters. In the 19th century, it was sort of viewed that the federal government was to deliver the mail, defend the shores, and not do much else. And that, perhaps a good man, wrong century.
Well, let us take that helicopter and tuck it off in a corner of your television screen here for a moment now, and let us remind you, compliments of our White House correspondent Britt Hume, who covered Bush and will now cover Clinton, a little bit about the Bush presidency over the last 4 years. A presidency interrupted.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
From its very start, 4 years ago today, this would be the most personal of presidencies. George Bush even paused at the beginning of his inaugural address to acknowledge a couple of personal pals from his days in Congress.
Hey, Jack. Danny.
He had many pals in Congress, and it now seems clear he hoped those friendships would help him avoid the bitter battles that had raged over the budget and taxes during the previous 8 years. Bush hoped to concentrate his energies elsewhere, on the foreign policy dealings that so intrigued him. Even here, though, his approach was intensely personal. His friendship with Mikhail Gorbachev has been the subject of much comment, but it's worth remembering that at the beginning their association was marked by suspicion and personal rivalry, especially during their storm-tossed first summit at Malta, when Mr. Bush surprised and upstaged Gorbachev with a series of unexpected proposals to further Soviet reforms. Once Bush determined that it was in his interest to work with Gorbachev, he courted him ardently, a process that culminated in Gorbachev's overnight visit to Camp David during their 1990 summit in the U.S. Gorbachev, the first Soviet leader to receive such treatment, even got a chance to drive the presidential golf cart.
President Bush, how was the meeting?
Just a minute, wait till I get out of this thing.
Before it was over, the usually stiffly formal Soviet leader was obviously having a good time, plainly charmed by the whole thing, and the Bush-Gorbachev friendship was sealed. Later, Bush would be criticized for clinging too long to Gorbachev, for waiting too long to transfer his loyalties to Boris Yeltsin. But as events of recent weeks have shown, Yeltsin, too, has been given the Bush treatment and seems as much a personal friend now as Gorbachev did then. Bush was criticized as well for going easy on his friends in the communist hierarchy in Beijing, where he once served as U.S. representative. Bush refused to cut off U.S. trade with China after the Tiananmen Square violence. He even sent his national security advisor there to hold secret meetings with and drink an infamous toast to the men who had ordered the massacre. During the Persian Gulf crisis, however, the critical moment in Bush's conduct of foreign policy, those friendships with the leaders in both Moscow and Beijing proved most useful. Both the Soviet Union and China were members of the UN Security Council, and both went along with the U.S.-backed resolutions demanding that Saddam Hussein's army get out of Kuwait and authorizing the use of force to back that up. It is not too much to say that without China and the Soviet Union, George Bush could not have gotten the legal authority to wage the Gulf War, his proudest achievement as president. At home, the president never quit trying to win over the Democratic leaders of Congress, but they proved tough adversaries, especially Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. Mitchell almost single-handedly blocked the Bush plan to cut the tax on capital gains, and he drove a hard bargain on the budget, forcing the president to eat his celebrated promise of no new taxes. There were some legislative achievements, but it was mostly a time when the leaders of Congress refused to pass Mr. Bush's bills and he refused to sign theirs. Gridlock. When the United States economy turned down and stayed down, the one thing that might have helped the president politically was an economic growth package, but he couldn't get that from Congress either. And it is no accident that in his last acts of recent weeks have been carried out with people overseas, with leaders overseas, and not with those here on Capitol Hill. Gentlemen?
Well, Brett, I don't think in this company of players this morning anybody has been closer to the president on a daily basis than you have. What do you think he believes history's judgment of him will be?
My sense is that he believes history will judge him kindly because he was skillful in managing the West's victory in the Cold War, because he succeeded in evicting Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait and rallying the international community to his side, that he believes history will see him as a man whose economic downturn, the economic downturn occurred at a bad time for him politically, that it will be rather forgiving to him on that. I don't think that he buys at all the idea that we're on the cusp of a great period of change that the public demands, and that a new generation is coming to power, and that is what drove the outcome of the election. I think he simply sees himself as a victim of circumstances and believes that history will see him as such as well.
And the Marine helicopter flies out across the Potomac to Andrews Air Force Base, passing that most majestic of needles, the Washington Monument, in a town that is enormously crowded today with people celebrating, yes, Governor Clinton, President Clinton's inauguration as president, but also celebrating what both he and President Bush have spoken of so many times the country means. But there is clearly something very final looking about this last trip on a Marine helicopter over to Andrews Air Force Base. We will be back in just a moment. The cabinet papers, which he is now signing, there's a great many specific things he must now first do.
Nobody can be in his cabinet until approved by the Congress, by the Senate, and signed by him. That's what he's doing now.
And not the entire approval process, of course, has been completed. Attorney General Zoe Baird's confirmation hearings are not completed yet. Ron Brown, the Secretary of Commerce designate. But as we watch President Clinton do this, being told precisely what to do, as so often hands the president. Look at the pens on the desk there, just beside his right hand. What treasures they will become. for people. They will be framed and put in offices or studies or in the living rooms of people who are honored and fortunate enough to get a presidential pen. But as we watch this proceeding, let's just get some final comments from as I call it, our company of players, beginning with you, Jim Wooten. You've been watching this from the White House, and first of all, did the moving truck get through the gate?
The moving truck is inside the White House walls now, and we assume, although it's out of sight now, we assume that the goods are now being unloaded. The thing that struck me about watching President Bush vacate the premises, as it were, was my feeling that he has come to terms with the fact that of his defeat. I talked with him a great deal in Somalia. I went with him to Somalia a couple of weeks ago, and he went on at great length about what peace he feels now about what he has done, and bears no rancor.
I apologize.
He's stealing a pen.
So Senator Ford's the boss here to that Senator Ford of Kentucky. Just picked up one of those pens, put it right in his pocket. It'll go to a grandchild, and the others, of course, go to Congressman Michael, to Senator Mitchell. So much for the lucky common man that gets a hand on one of these pens. Senator Simpson from Wyoming. The Speaker on his right, Senator Joel Hedlund.
Well, the pens they buy are not exactly fancy ones.
I apologize. Some final thoughts for this morning, at least, from Kofi Roberts.
Hello. Final thoughts are, at least from this this opening ceremony, is that that you really have a Congress and a president that at the moment seem to be ready to work together. The Democrats in Congress claim, at least for these 5 minutes, that they understand that the Democratic Party is on trial now, that they really do have to be new kinds of Democrats for the people to come behind them in any significant way. And this speech did address those themes, the themes of responsibility, of duty, of sacrifice, all of the things that people want to hear from Democrats that they haven't heard in a very long time.
Very quickly from you, Jeff Greenfield, as President Bush lands at Andrews Air Force Base.
Well, Peter, when Bill Clinton told the Haitians they might be able to come to America, they went out and built hundreds of boats, which caused a great problem for him. Metaphorically, a lot of Americans built boats to come to where Bill Clinton said he wanted to lead this country. And beyond the ceremony and beyond the very glitzy parties tonight, that's the test for Bill Clinton. You know, we built some boats in this country, and are they going to get to go where he said we're going to get to go to?
When Lyndon Johnson left at the end of his term and flew to Texas in Air Force 2, I guess it was, they took his baggage off the plane, set it down on the ground, and flew away. He was infuriated because prior to that they'd had limousines and people to move his baggage and so on. They had to put his bags on the ground and left.
I think it must be one of the most difficult transitions a person can make, from being totally cared for to be, and I think that Senator Hal Heflin from Alabama there, I'm not sure, saying a quick hello. It is enormously difficult. Everything is done for you. For heaven's sake, everything's done for the White House press corps when they travel. Think what's happened for the president.
And nothing is done for you. Johnson had to carry his own bags.
Here again, you had this opportunity to see the incoming president and the outgoing president. And to remind you, as we watch here, just some of the phrases that may ring with greater resonance outside the Beltway than they do inside, when President Clinton said that a generation raised in the shadow of the Cold War assumes new responsibilities in a world which is, while warmed by the sunshine of freedom, is still threatened by ancient hatreds and new plagues. Clearly a reference to the challenges he has to meet overseas in the former Soviet Empire, which is dissolving, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in parts of Africa. He talked about profound and powerful forces shaking and remaking the world, and the urgent question for his generation, as far as he's concerned, whether they can make change a friend and not an enemy. He talked about the drift that had occurred in the society and raised the issue, which it is an issue for many Americans, of whether or not it had shaken American confidence and whether America was now reluctant to be as aggressive in the rest of the world and would be too preoccupied with matters at home to abdicate political leadership.